Hey everyone, this is Rocky from the Professional Communication Modules, and welcome to Part 2, the final part of this short series on how to cite your sources professionally. In this video, we're just going to give a quick recap of the 3 different ways that you can incorporate information into your work. I'm going to give you a couple more practical examples of quoting and paraphrasing, and I'll give you a resource that you can use to find and evaluate solid sources in the finance field. You'll probably be aware of most of them anyway, but I think it'll be a handy resource to have. Alright, so let's get started. Just a very quick recap. What does it mean to cite a source, and what are the different ways that you can do it? Well, we've looked at quoting, we looked at paraphrasing, and we very briefly mentioned summarizing, I think, in the first video. Quoting is just when you repeat exact words. You have to make sure that you use quotation marks, and of course you cite the source. Paraphrasing is when you take one or two key ideas, usually one key idea from another source, and weave that idea into your argument. And of course you don't use quotation marks here because you've created a whole new sentence, made it your own, and incorporated it in a unique way, and you would still cite the source there. Summarizing we didn't talk about too much, but just quickly contrast it with paraphrasing. Paraphrasing concentrates on one or two key ideas that are most relevant to your paper. Summarizing is usually just an exercise on its own to recap an entire work in a sentence or two, or maybe just could be a paragraph, but in a much shorter length than the original. We won't really deal anymore with that, but just mentioning it because it can be confused with paraphrasing. Alright, so let's look at quoting sources, and let's just take a very simple example. If this is our original text, their stock increased 3 points this quarter. Very simple, direct sentence. And let's say we wanted to quote this directly. Well, all we would have to do is put quotations around it and make sure you stick your footnote there. Notice that the footnote goes at the end, outside the period. If we want to selectively present some of the original material, maybe it's a really long quote, like an entire paragraph, and we only want a couple key parts. You can use what are called ellipsis points. Those are those little dots here. And you can cut out parts that aren't so relevant to your reader. You just have to be very careful when you do this that you're not changing the effect of the quote. So you don't want to use these types of omissions to intentionally make the reader misinterpret the original author's idea. The point of the ellipsis is just to make it a little more practical for the reader to see how the quoted material relates to your document, because you're just focusing on a couple key points that are most relevant. Again, of course, we would put everything in quotation marks, and we would add a footnote. The last thing I'll say about ellipsis points is actually what Chicago style and most styles use, or something called a 3-dot, 4-dot system. If you want to read about that more, you can look in the Chicago manual or the Turabian manual, but I'm not going to go into it too much here. I just want you to know the idea of using ellipsis points, and that you can use them in your papers. Okay, so the opposite of omitting material is to add material. You can add some material into quotes if it's necessary to understand. For example, let's imagine here that the reader might not know what the pronoun there refers to. So you could add in square brackets the name of the company or whatever that this referred to. That's one way to add material. Sometimes you have to change a word, like the verb tense of a word, so that it fits grammatically with your sentence. So you could do that. You could change the verb tense, but again, you would have to enclose that in square brackets. Basically, any time that you make an addition or modification to the quote, it should be in square brackets. That tells the reader that it's yours. If you use regular parentheses, that's actually confusing, because the regular parentheses would indicate that it was in the original text. So just a couple ways that you can use quotes there. Just remember that anytime you quote anything at all in your document, you always want to introduce your quote. Don't just plop the quote in, like in the last slide that we saw here. If we just had this, okay, and you just dropped this sentence into your paragraph with no introduction, nothing after it, nothing to explain to the reader why it was there, the reader is likely going to be confused. So always you want to introduce your quote. Okay, let's take a look at how you can do that. There's something that I like to call source phrases. This isn't an official name, it's just a name that I use, and something called descriptive phrases. Source phrases are really boring, bland, generic phrases like according to so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. Smith stated that. Smith said. So incredibly boring. And on top of being boring, it doesn't tell the reader anything. I mean, the quotation marks plus the footnote already tell the reader this information. So this kind of introduction is completely useless, really. I mean, the only time you can use this is maybe if you have you're incorporating a lot of quotes, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, but maybe you've run out of ideas for how to, incorporate them in more interesting ways. Or maybe you really want to highlight the speaker. That could happen once in a while. Some chief executive officer or somebody who's internationally respected on that opinion, it might make sense to mention his or her name just to give your sentence a little bit more clout. But for the most part, you want to use what are called descriptive phrases. So descriptive phrases could be just a few words, or they could be an entire clause, or even maybe an entire sentence. But the idea is that you're using some text to introduce your quote in a way that is meaningful to the reader and shows the reader how the quoted material fits into your argument. We have to completely imagine this because we don't have an assignment in front of us. We don't have a document or any context. But just as one example, the new product lines appear to be working as or because AT&T stock increased. So the reader knows why you included this stock. It's being used as one piece of data to support your argument that the product lines are working. That's just one idea. You can introduce quotes in a lot of ways, but just remember that these kind of source phrases are boring and almost useless, and using your own words, a clause or a phrase or even a whole sentence to introduce your quote is really how you should be doing it. And again, you shouldn't be quoting very much at all. You should be paraphrasing as much as possible. But when you do quote, do it with descriptive phrases. Let's look at paraphrasing sources. We did this last week, but I want to give another example. Just some quick guidelines though. First, when you paraphrase, make sure you understand the idea or the context. We talked about this. Read the source. Focus on one important idea that's most relevant to your work. And just a practical tip is to look away from the original source before you start to type on your own document. Because if you're looking at the original source while you're typing, chances are you're going to try to mimic the same sentence, without even maybe wanting to intentionally. It's just how our brains work. So try to get your eyes and your brain away from the original and think on your own as you write your own sentence. This will help you write the idea in your own sentence structure, use your own words, and at the very end you could take a look and make sure that you haven't done anything too similar to the original. Some common mistakes are basically the opposite of all these: copying a sentence in and just using some synonyms, reproducing the same sentence structure, or just outright forgetting the citation or making it unclear that this idea is someone else's. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because we looked at it last week. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can paraphrase effectively and how we shouldn't do it. So just take a moment to read this short blurb. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to read this, let's look at how you would not want to go about this. If you look at the words in green here, well, there's a lot of reasons that this is a bad way to paraphrase. One is that it's the exact same sentence structure, the exact same progression of ideas. So what do we have? 1, 2, 3 sentences, 1, 2, 3 sentences. So the same number of sentences, the same progression of ideas, almost the same wording. The only difference is that I use synonyms for all these spots in green. So even though I changed 50% of this mini paragraph, I've basically just reproduced the whole original. And this is a terrible thing to do. Not only is this bad paraphrasing, this basically qualifies as plagiarism as far as I'm concerned. So don't do it this way. Instead, focus on one idea. We have a lot of ideas in the original here, right? Apple no longer is the darling of Wall Street. Despite a recent rebound, investors might still be looking at Apple as a potential bargain. The stock has lost 30% of its value. Again, this is old information, but we're just looking as an example. So what do we do here? This is how you can use your own words and sentence structure to tell the reader something more. And this would be set in context of your larger discussion. Also here we used a footnote, which was blatantly missing above. But okay, hopefully you can see the different approach. This poor paraphrase is just almost an exact reproduction of everything. Structure, words, ideas, and this here is taking the ideas and putting them in a way that relates to your overall argument. Okay, so if you can't repeat the sentence structure and you can't repeat the progression of ideas and you can't repeat the exact words, is there anything that you can repeat? Well, you can use some common phrases from your field. For example, trickle-down theory, fixed charge coverage ratio, Fortune 500, basically any finance terms, because it would be a pretty silly idea to try to find a synonym for fixed charge coverage ratio and other finance terms. It doesn't make any sense because those are exact terms. You can use technical terminology, it's not a problem. Names of people, names of places. But other than that, you basically want to be creating an entirely new sentence structure, adding some sort of emphasis, some cause and effect, some contrast, weave the idea into your argument in some unique way. So that's really what you should be concentrating your efforts on, not finding synonyms. All right, let's look at some types of sources that we can use in the finance field. You've probably heard of a lot of different ones, but your sources, whatever they are, you should be finding sources that are primary. So you don't want to cite somebody else's citation. Go directly to the source whenever possible. Anytime you can find sources that are professionally peer-reviewed, that's great. Examples of that are academic journal articles. They're not always so current as, for example, news articles, but news articles are also peer-reviewed in a certain ways because they have an entire in-depth editorial process that they go through before they publish them. So fact checkers, editors of 3 different levels or 4 different levels, fact checkers again, editors again, it's like a machine. So especially the most respected newspapers, it's pretty good information. I would say that newspapers are a great place to start whenever possible, but you want to try to go into more in-depth reports or raw data or whatever the newspaper article is talking about. Maybe they cite a source, you could go directly to that source, but they're still pretty decent sources a lot of times in the finance field because everything moves so quickly. So news is good too. You want to, of course, always look for respected sources. So what are those? Well, if you have a choice between maybe a small local paper and the Wall Street Journal, then you probably could see that the Wall Street Journal is going to be more widely read, more widely respected. If you have a choice between some individual's blog, where he just writes on his own or she writes on her own and doesn't have anyone checking facts or checking for holes in the argument, that of course isn't going to be as strong as maybe a blog maintained by a professional finance publisher in the field. Some more and more sites are having their own blogs, so they're pretty close to news articles anyway, but they're essentially opinion pieces, so you want to look at who is giving the opinion. Also, you'll probably be familiar with a lot of the big publishers in your field, which institutions and organizations and branches of the government are most respected when it comes to speaking to the issues in your field. But even within some well-known publishers, you always want to evaluate each source. So if you're reading a particular piece, maybe a news article, for example, from Bloomberg, which is a respected source, well, you might find that on that particular day, that particular author maybe wasn't quite as rigorous with the method or with the progression of ideas in the document. So maybe that one news article isn't a great one to cite. So go look for some other information on that event. Whatever happens, go to some other competing news sites in the finance field and find a better article. You can do that. You don't always have to, even if you like Bloomberg or Vanguard or Reuters or whatever you're using, every day the information's a little different. So you always want to evaluate it piece by piece. The last thing I would say is that you want to use retrievable data whenever possible. More and more we can locate almost everything online. So try to avoid very obscure information like company notes that you found on some personal webpage that might disappear next week. If you do have to use something very obscure like that, try to download a copy or take a screenshot so that you can present it to your readers if they ask you questions about it, and try to keep a timestamp and a date stamp on that for future purposes. Okay, so let's look at some good places to find finance sources. You can look at live feeds and news. This is like Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, and a bunch of others. Research and reports. It could be like Vanguard, Reuters, World Bank. IMF and others. There are some cool research platforms in the finance field. I know at Temple, for example, I think you have access to Capital IQ and Morningstar Direct, among a couple others. So use those to your advantage. Academic journals, which you can find through the library website or Google Scholar, or just searching online. Things like Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, and there's probably hundreds and hundreds of them in the finance field. I'll show you how to find some of the best ones in a moment. You'll notice that I did not list Wikipedia on this. Please do not cite Wikipedia. I get this every semester. Wikipedia is okay to start your research. Okay, there's really only one way that you can use Wikipedia. Let's imagine that I was doing some company report on King Arthur, and I wanted to cite something. Well, you should not cite anything from this page. If you find something that's interesting, let's say I like something that I found in this first paragraph, go to the footnote here, which Wikipedia does have. Go to the link. Oops, should be an external link. Okay, if it's not, then what you can do is search for in this case it's a book, okay, it's a cookbook, and they have some company history in it. So I could do that, I could buy that book, or let's say you wanted to cite something else, then, for example, an article, and usually there's external links to that, and you can read that information and maybe find something else. The reason that it's important to use this original sources is because, one, anybody can write a wiki. So I could go on here and change half of this, and it might take months for somebody to figure out that it was sabotaged. But actually, it's not quite so easy to do that now because they have a lot of volunteers. But anybody can publish something. And even if it's not complete garbage what I wrote, it's not like I'm a professional on King Arthur if I wrote something like this. So you don't know anything about the author. You don't know, how accurate the information is. It was peer reviewed in the sense of other individuals, but it wasn't professionally peer reviewed like a news article or like a scholarly journal article. So don't cite any of this directly. Instead, go to the sources and cite those. The other advantage of going to the original source is that, if I click through here, for example, and I say, oh, maybe I, want to find out more about this area, and then maybe I find some other information that's useful in the history of the area, and somehow that relates to how the company was started, and it just goes on from there. So you're fueling your research. So you can use Wikipedia as a first step, but do not use it as a direct citation. So you would actually, instead of citing this in your note, you would go directly to the source. In this case, it was the cookbook, the introduction, and cite that directly. Plus, you want to read that information and make sure that it really does relate to your discussion, because maybe the way that the person who wrote the wiki used that information isn't really the way that you would see fit to use it, or maybe you don't think it's even accurate. So you have to evaluate it for yourself. Okay, I'm just going to give you a quick resource that's now up on the Business Writing Tutorials website. It's on the resources page if you haven't checked this out yet. It's this one here, Finance Research Sources. So click on Go to Resource, and you can download this. Okay, so this is these are some of the columns that I talked about in the presentation, but I put some links here. For example, the research platforms, the ones that Temple has given you access to, I didn't link to the Capital IQ homepage. I linked to the Temple page because they explain here, for example, how you can log on to Capital IQ, how you can create an account with Bloomberg, and you can look down here and see what's most useful to you. For live feeds and news, obviously these aren't ranked anyway. I just put some down that I know off the top of my head that are decent, and you probably know many more from your own research. You can use the ones you like, but maybe this will give you some other ideas. Wall Street is spelled wrong. I'll have to update that. Research and reports, I think this is an underutilized one. I think this is even better than news. So a lot of times when you go to a news article, they'll say, according to such and such report, 3% of blah, blah, blah. So what you can usually do is link directly to that full report, or at least to the press release of that report. Or if the news article didn't provide a link, you can search for the report online. It'll usually come up right away, especially if you have the full name of the report. If not, you might have to, if they said, for example, according to a recent report by Morgan Stanley, Well, you might have to go to Morgan Stanley's page where they list their research and publications. And for example, they have these series they call Blue Papers. And check and see. And if it's recent, then it'll probably be on here. If not, you can search their site and find it. Okay, so these are just some different places you can get reports. Reports are, of course, going to be a little more rigorous and in-depth than a news article. A news article usually just reports one statistic or two statistics and a couple of quotes. You want to go a little bit deeper than that for your research, so you can use these sites and other similar sites. Academic journals can be very useful. There's a lot of great information, a lot of finance journals, but because of how fast the field of finance moves, you're going to have to limit your searches probably to the past year or two. So if you go to, for example, and whatever it is that you're looking for, on the left here, you want to limit your searches probably from publication date. You have to think of what's relevant. If you're talking about housing markets and you have journals from 2008, it's just not relevant anymore. So probably from the past couple years, I would say maximum, and then you can limit them to just journal articles, for example, or if you want to do reports, and then you can limit them in different ways and take a look. A lot of the full text is linked directly from these articles, so you have access to a lot of good stuff through the Temple Library. You can also look for databases. For example, one that comes to mind is Web of Science by Reuters, and you'll have to log in to see this page, but once you do, you'll get it, and you can do searches. This is sort of like a meta search, so you can get information from a lot of places. You can start your search here. Also, there's something interesting, is something they have called Journal Citation Reports, which I believe they put out yearly, and they rank journals. So you could, if you weren't sure which journals to look at, this is all journals, but you can select categories, and this is pretty cool. You can go to, I think it's under business, business finance. It's not directly under finance. And then you have to go down and submit that to update the results. And they give rankings actually of, which they have their whole complicated methodology of how they do this, but you'll get a sense of which ones are more respectable than others. And then you can go directly to those sites, or you could, let's say you wanted to search review of financial studies. You could go back to the library site. And I already forget, what was a review of financial studies? You could search for this journal. And then one of the nice things about doing it this way is that you can browse. So sometimes actually browsing it's underrated. Because especially if you find, let's say you find one article that you like from an issue from a couple months ago, you could actually go through and look at all the archives, and a lot of times they'll have similar articles within an issue, because they'll do some focus on that issue. So if you find an article that you like from May 2015, you might find 3 other good articles in there too. So again, these are great sources if you can incorporate something academic into your argument. It's going to hold some clout, because especially in the top journals, especially in the most respected journals, their peer review process to get published in those is quite serious. So it doesn't mean that everything published is correct. I mean, there's competing perspectives in all those journals, but that at least the data were checked, the methodology was challenged, the writing was evaluated. So you've got some confidence in what was put out there. You might not agree with it, but it's something that at least is professional. Okay, so you've got a lot of things that you can look at here. I did include some things that you shouldn't use, for example, Wikipedia. Similarly, Britannica and other encyclopedias, they're not as bad as Wikipedia because it's not like anybody can write them. But encyclopedias are just really general sources. They're places where you can start your research, but not really what you should be citing. You should just use them as jumping off points. Same thing for informal blogs, like I mentioned before. You can get some good ideas from people's blogs because they have their opinions, and it might be an interesting perspective, but you want to evaluate those perspectives on more respected sites, and you should only cite information from the more respected sites afterwards. So use them as jumping off points. You want to avoid secondary sources, like I said, because you should be evaluating the information for yourself, not just trusting that the author you're reading from cited it in a way that's accurate and that it relates to your argument. You should go directly to the source of the information, evaluate that for yourself. And of course, outdated sources, especially in finance, you want to stay current. So, be careful about citing something from several years ago, as it might not apply. Okay, hopefully this is useful to you. You can, if you want an Excel copy, I'll put that up too, if you want to add to your own list so that you can keep a running list of places that you like to research. I don't know how useful that'll be, but if it is for you, then I'll put it up there. All right, I hope that this video lesson was helpful. There'll be a short quiz after this, and then I'll give you the instructions on the assignment.